Beginning mornings.
Great. There it is. You never know. You never know. We are live. Denelle Dixon, the executive CEO of Stellar. Really excited to have you on. How you doing? How's your day going?
I'm great. It's been a wonderful day. It's gorgeous outside. So yeah, thank you. I'm so pleased to be here.
Yeah. And just for people who may not know who you are or what you're working on, do you want to just give a quick background?
Sure. So I'm the CEO and executive director of the Stellar Development Foundation. The foundation is a nonprofit, non-stock entity, which sole mission is to focus on the development of the Stellar network and also the growth of the Stellar ecosystem. And the Stellar network is a decentralized, open blockchain network that's focused on payments and asset issuance. There's a lot more detail around that, but that's the big picture.
And yeah, so tell me about. You're curious about your story. A little bit pre-show, you were talking about you did law school and lived in Hawaii. How did you get into where you're at now?
Yeah, so I was a trial lawyer for many years after I went to law school. I loved being a trial lawyer. But I also loved the idea of just learning about tech and like really getting in deep with the different clients and like what they were doing and the technology side. So that pushed me into the tech sector. I worked at several different tech companies. And then I went in, and after I'd done that for a while, I was like, oh, I'm going to go into private equity, and I'm going to look at private equity and see what you can do with respect to portfolio companies and investments and think about that. So that really opened my mind up to business. And then from there, I went to work at Mozilla. And at Mozilla, I was the chief operating officer, and I managed most of the business side, all the revenue side, and also some products and a lot of the infrastructure pieces. And I just loved the work that I did there. But one of my favorite areas was policy. And so a lot of policy work with respect to the web and openness and keeping the web transparent and being very aggressive with respect to those issues. And frankly, that's kind of how I got into blockchain, because so many of those things that we did in the early days of the web, really focusing on standards and really focusing on interoperability. It's a lot of what's needed over here. So Jed reached out. I thought Jed's the founder of Jed McCaleb, who's the founder of the Stellar Network and the Stellar Development Foundation. He reached out, and I thought he was looking for a board member. And in fact, he was looking for an executive director. And so we just started talking. We talked for 9 months or so. And then I was like, this is kind of it. All the things on the policy side and all the things on the business side that I learned sort of lined up really nicely with respect to this mission driven company that we have.
Wow. Well, I'm curious. So you talked for 9 months. That's a long
Yeah,
conversation. Did
we
you?
did.
Were you? Did he kind of coerce you or convince you to join after that amount of time, or what was your hesitation, or not hesitation per se, but
Yeah.
what were you thinking about? Because all of this is very new. Just taking a step back, what crypto roughly 10 years old. So just to wrap your mind around conceptually what it is for the first time, there's always this skepticism that people have, all
Mm-hmm.
I think humans have, and then it kind of clicks, and when it clicks, you just realize, oh, this is like another evolution of sorts, like another
Yes.
wave of technology. How did he say
Yeah.
something to you, or do you remember how that went?
Yeah, no, I mean, the truth of the matter is, we started talking in August of 2018, and I was pretty sold by December. I just needed to get some things done when I was for Mozilla. But I'll tell you, like, the clicking for me was all about the notion of all of the learnings from the early days of the web. And so much of what I think, like at the time, we were like vehemently in disagreement with government regulation, and we believed that we knew everything and that we could tell everybody how to think about privacy and all of these different things that I think we've learned now we were wrong about. Like, we really should have been engaging with the government. We really should have been addressing some of these privacy issues by standards. We really should have been focused a lot more on standards, so we didn't get to this world where we have several companies who essentially own the content side of the web. And so a lot of that just sort of resonated deeply. And I thought, specifically when you're dealing with finance and when you're dealing with fiat and when you're dealing with money, these are areas the government knows how to regulate really well, but they don't know how to innovate really well. And so we could actually do that public to private, cooperation on this side that we didn't do very well on the content side of the web in the early days, and help to make that leap so that this technology could really take root and then grow. And so that was really I was sold,
Mm,
and I really loved that thought
mm,
about how we could approach this. And I'm just an avid believer in interoperability and openness, because if we have those standards, particularly when you're dealing with money, we're never going to go back to the days where everything will be, region by region different. And instead, you can enhance it all
yeah.
by having this interoperability layer that bridges it all. So though that's just, I'm super passionate about it. And I feel like we could take so many of the learnings from the early days of the web and try to apply them here in ways that I think we weren't as effective at on the content side.
Yeah. Yeah. It
So that
reminds me,
sold
as a
me. The
side note, I
blockchain
like
stuff,
that story.
I just say the blockchain
Yeah.
stuff was like interesting, and I loved it, and I thought there was huge opportunity, and I just wanted to be able to marry those two. But I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah. No, no, no. You're so right. I think it does feel like interoperability is just conceptually, it's what is it really? It's getting together, building a consensus around how to communicate with whatever technology you're using. I was going to say, I remember I was reading this book a couple months ago on the history of the railroads in the United States, and apparently interoperability back in the railroads was a real problem because people were using different types of rails, and so you couldn't just take a train across different rail providers. They had to, go to a station and an offboard and get on to a new one. And the United States apparently was the first to standardize the dimensions of rails, like how far away they are and how thick they are. So trains could just, go across on different rails. And that concept was, huge in the evolution of our country because it allows people to just, build trains and go from different point A to point B. And it's probably the first I can think of example of interoperability being, hugely impactful to society. So it's interesting to think how that went from, railroads to probably HTTP and email protocols and the internet and TCP/IP and now this. It feels like what you guys are doing at Stellar is hugely foundational and almost, I hesitate to say obvious, but it's just paramount to having things work behind the scenes. Um, I'm curious to hear your perspective on how where the world is today with respect to the incumbent system of banking and how that kind of shifts into the modern day framework of blockchain.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love that story of the railroad, and it could apply in so many different ways. When you were talking, I was thinking about electric cars and the plugs that if we had them all standard, then you wouldn't need to worry about making sure that your Tesla was able. And
Yeah.
there are modules that you can use now to connect up, or that your other car. I love that idea that transportation is exactly the same issue, because this is just transportation in a digital way of value. And so it's a very similar dynamic. I think if you look at the correspondent banking system today and just how fractured it is, there's so many fissures and so many challenges. There's so much friction in the system. To be able to, get a payment, it seems simple domestically for us to get, our money out of different, one from one bank to another, or from one to make payments. But still, it actually takes way more time than is necessary. So even domestically in the US, it's a challenge that I don't think that we've taken it just for granted that that's the length of time. When I move money from one of my banks to a different bank, it takes like 4 days to get there. It shouldn't, right? It could be super simple. So if you think about correspondent banking
Yeah.
and the way that you could use blockchain and this new language to be able to enhance this infrastructure, not supplant it, because I think you don't, if you try to supplant everything and change it all, it's going to take a really long time for adoption. But if you can enhance it and offer this as another rail, and this is a faster rail, particularly with respect to cross-border transactions, which is what we're focused on, it just seems so simple, and it actually makes it so that everyone can speak the same language, can leverage the low transaction fees, can be able to get into borders that historically have been very challenging, offer services at a regional level that a lot of unbanked or underbanked folks have never had access to. So this just enhances the correspondent banking and the existing financial infrastructure. And it also expands it into different parts of the globe that haven't had those same services that we've had access to in the US, for example, or some parts of the US. Not even all the US is banked, and some of them are underbanked. So I think it's one of the things that it could actually just
Mhm.
help everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm always amazed whenever I send a ACH transfer in particular. I've dug pretty deep and I still don't understand it. But the ACH system, which I know that it stands for automated clearinghouse, but the fact that it takes 3, sometimes 4 days to send money and it doesn't work on weekends or bank holidays. And I don't quite, I've asked banks, if I'm on the phone with them, is somebody manually reviewing each of these transactions? And all I get is that it's on age old technology. But it feels like if Stellar is, when Stellar is successful, the ACH system should be filed away, right? We don't. Is that true? Do you think of the ACH as being what is probably the primary way people send money between bank accounts aside from wire transfers?
I
Um,
think that both Wire and ACH are going to still continue to exist. I think that they will be leveraged for the opportunities that are simplest for those, or that they're going to be bring the
mm,
most value to be able to leverage them. Also, I think Wire and ACH are sometimes ways to get on ramp into the blockchain. And so there will be ways that some
mm,
companies offer those as opportunities for the on ramp. You need on and off ramp so that you can touch your fiat. So I don't want to make it so that those, or I don't believe that they will ever be not useful. I just think that when you actually are contemplating what blockchain offers, and you think about speed and scale and low cost to the developer, because again, like there are going to be fees that layer on top of it, but right now on Stellar, the cost of a transaction is 1/100th of a penny. And when you think about that, and then you think
mm,
you can still have fees on top of that to be able to, make up for the different costs that the other folks that are going to be involved in the transaction have, it's still going to be cheaper than any other, competitive with any of the options that you have today. That is an important like ground for us to achieve. And then the other thing is when you think about microtransactions, you're not going to use ACH or wires for these small transactions because it's just too expensive. So nobody does that. And so now, like
hmm
blockchain could just offer that so simply. And again, fees so low that you don't actually feel it. So it's an important invention. It's an important, it's not aspirational. It's actually happening today. Like these cross border payments and the
hmm
leveraging of stable coins, it's happening today. And so now we just sort of need to get everybody comfortable with the idea that these are regulated entities that are involved in touching fiat. These are regulated entities that do the on and off ramps, and let's just allow this public to private conversation to continue so that we can actually create more innovation for all the correspondent banking system, but also like all of the different countries that don't have the banking system as robust as we do, to make it so that it's really simple to integrate.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I'm always so intrigued by how the government, just from a philosophical standpoint, the government's role in banking, historically, we've needed a centralized place to print money and to prosecute people who are faking printing money. And that kind of is, it's not as true as it once was. I don't know if it still is totally true, but the government, at least in the US, has a really heavy hand. It feels like, especially since 2001, the Patriot Act, with the banks, the BSA laws and FinCEN, there, it seems like we as in the government is pretty hands-on. They want to know transactions frequently, who makes those transactions with KYC. Do you get a sense for where the pendulum is? Like, are we swinging towards more centralized oversight, or are we at the peak point or swinging back? I'm curious your thoughts, because there's obviously some price you pay if you on either side. If you have too much security, then everything is being monitored and you're vulnerable to a government that doesn't have the best intentions doing bad things. And then that flip side, if it's completely wild west and there's no oversight, then what happens? People steal, they do fraudulent things. um, yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
So I love the way you just articulated both sides of it, because basically my thought is there needs to be a balance. And I believe this in almost every layer of technology that we have. I believe this for encryption, for it's the very similar thing. When you actually give if you give the government access to an encrypted communication because they need it for security and for safety, you're actually not just giving access to the government, you're giving it to everyone, right? Because if there's a way to get into that for the government purposes, others are going to be able to hack that too. So it's a similar model that you have to think
Mm.
through. Where's the balance and what's the value? What's the purpose that you're driving at? We're driving at making sure that there are services that are available to the many and that it's secure, but that it's not centralized so much so that it's just what happens today is the current banking system isn't actually set up for like all people. It's only set up for a certain category of people. There are
Mm.
people who aren't part of the formal, um, they don't work in like a formal role. So they actually get paid outside of this and they actually can't participate in the banking system then. So the informal economy makes it really challenging for folks to be able to get bank accounts. You may also, they have limits on in terms of how much money you have to put in the bank account to be able to get one. So and many people can't put enough money in to meet those limits. There's also fees that come off that they just can't afford to pay. So the banking system isn't made for the many, it's actually made for the few. And so what we need to do today is to try to expand that banking system to the many. And that means that you have to give up a little bit on the centralization piece and allow these decentralized activities to participate. But you don't have to give up on the compliance part. You don't have to make it so that this is the wild, wild west, but you have to be rational and open to different ideas about how to do it. And I think actually blockchain really delivers that today. I think particularly if you think about Stellar has compliance mechanisms built in for any issuer of an asset. So if you issue an asset, you can determine when you're going to require those KYC, which are know your customer, or the AML, which is
Mm.
the anti-money laundering, where you want those checks to be. Do you want them at the very time that they get access to the asset? Do you want to do them at redemption? Do you want to do them in transit? Like you can have those checks in place so that you're still actually supporting the compliance rules of each geography. And you make sure that anytime whoever touches fiat is supporting those rules, but you have to have a balance because too much centralization stifles innovation, stifles the opportunity for the many to be involved. And then, there's an argument that if there's like the wild, wild west, then it actually could be harmful to some of the folks who don't know, they don't know how to engage with the system and they could lose a lot of their assets. The government's role is to protect against crime and
Mm.
fraud and do the consumer protection angle. And I think that if you balance those two, innovation with the notion of what the government's really trying to do here, you can get to a pretty great place. We did that with the web technologies, like
Mm.
openness, innovation, allowing growth, not stifling that. And I think we're headed in the right direction here. And with the central bank issuing potential digital currencies in different regions, I think the central bank could have a really strong role still, as long as it actually leveraged the private institutions that have been innovating already in blockchain, for example.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The World Bank is I want to touch on that in a second, but I also want to say I was talking about this with a friend of mine recently that there seems to me to be this effect that politicians don't quite. I don't know if it's that they don't get it or what, or maybe you have a reaction to this. But say, for instance, take minimum wage. If you take minimum wage or really any tax and you put if it goes too high, then you're actually counter to your goals. If you had minimum wage at $50 an hour, for instance, well, people just wouldn't abide by that. They would just pay in cash because they need to hire, a nanny or a driver or somebody. And then the whole idea of being able to tax people or being able to provide higher wages for people, it's counter to the goal. And I sometimes think that by having too much oversight, you're incentivizing people to go around the system. Even someone who's if I have to go on a website and I have to do KYC and it takes 2 days, and then there's this other questionnaire I have to answer, and I just have good intentions anyways, I might not do that. That's just friction in a sense. And I, I wonder how that sort of plays out, because it should be like there's a local optimum. It's like the least amount of friction and the least amount of oversight for the whole purpose of what the government supposedly cares about, which is anti-money laundering, so not buying things that are illegal or potentially harmful. And then that I don't know. I what am I trying to say? I sometimes feel there's not an appreciation for that pendulum, for the swing of
Yeah.
like with the cost of being too oversight. And I don't know that we are. I actually found the government, at least in FinCEN, when we were working with them, to be pretty intelligent and thoughtful when it comes to making these laws. And I think they did a great job when the internet first came around. They didn't block it. A good example of this is like New York. Why is what is the global hub for financial transactions, Wall Street, why is that the least friendly state for crypto? And I think it's a little bit of the Wall Street bankers didn't want to give up the power, right? Do you feel like it's a power struggle among people in that state? I don't know. I'm
I think
just
it's an interesting question. I think where you're getting at is the fact that when you focus too much on consumer protection and you focus too much on the bad side, you're not giving any credence or credit to the opportunities and the potential that the
mm,
technology brings, right? And so one of the things that I think helps to solve this, and I think that the New York example is an interesting one because I do think that there's a lot of really good focus in New York. DFS, like a lot of they really do want to expand the offerings and to make it valuable for the constituents in their state. But there's also a really strong arm of
mm,
consumer protection. And so it's where that falls. And so much of that for
mm,
governments and for it's about how we engage with them. If you stiff arm them and you say, hey, we got this, we actually don't need you to like come in and tell us how to do these things, we have it figured out, it actually ends up with that they're more fearful of the technology and the innovation, and then they try to come in and they overregulate. So there's this really healthy
mm,
balance between understanding the needs of the government and the regulators and understanding the needs of the innovation and trying to find that match. And where is that? And it's never going to be perfectly in the center. It's always going to lean more on one side or the other, but it vacillates back and forth. But so much of it is it's incumbent upon industry to really talk to the government and explain the value, not the technology. If we keep talking about the technology itself can be scary. If you talk about the use cases and the
mm,
value that it drives to their constituents, they are not going to want to be the only place that doesn't allow it. And so this is my big thing is that we
mm,
spend time with government regulators all over the world, and what we want them to feel is if I don't allow this in our region, we're missing out on a huge opportunity for our constituents. But we only do that by talking about use cases and by recognizing that yes, there are challenges, regulatory and consumer protection challenges, and here's how we've thought about how to address those. So some of it is going through the compliance mechanisms, making sure they understand it. Some of it is making clear that when you get off the blockchain and you're on an off ramp, that there will be KYC. And so if there is a transaction that they think is fraudulent, they can actually get to the KYC, frankly, in a much cleaner way than they could with cash. So there are things that we talk about with them that actually explain it and it relieves some of the fear. But so much of it is about that conversation rather than ignoring them. It's about having that. And I feel, and that's why I loved coming to Stellar and SDF, because I felt like we have the opportunity to help address it, not just for Stellar, but for the ecosystem, because that's the whole notion. It's particularly applicable in finance when a rising tide floats all boats. So what's good for the some is going to be good for the many
yeah.
if we get regulators to understand it.
Yeah, yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. Tell me about the Stellar team a little bit. How many people and what's the focus of the different teams right
Yeah,
now?
that's a good question. I actually don't know the specific number because we've been hiring a lot lately, but we're close to 100 or just over
Sure.
100 in terms of our numbers. When I started, we had 12. So for me, this is like a
Wow.
huge growth in 2 years, particularly during a year of a pandemic. And so we have teams that are focused on core, which is the consensus protocol and how the protocol is set up in the network. And they work a lot with the ecosystem and community to be able to make sure we're being responsive. We have folks that work on applications like Vibrant, which is an application that's focused on Argentina, which helps to allow
Hmm.
someone to hold USDC. And they can take their fiat, convert it to Argentinian digital currency, and then convert it to USDC and hold it as a mechanism for hyperinflation to stem that tide. And we have a
Mm.
focus. We have groups that focus on that. We have folks that work on Horizon, which is our platform. It's the ingestion engine for the network, and it's how you really can get into the network. And we have folks that do that. Then we have a lot of people that work on partner engineering, which is helping companies really integrate with Stellar and what's the value that they can get from it, how to best integrate with
Mm,
them. We have an enterprise team that's an enterprise fund, which is focused on investment. So we have folks that do that. We have policy and legal and all those
mm,
things. But like the most important thing of what everyone does at SDF is really focus on ecosystem. We have an ecosystem team that spends tons of time with the ecosystem growth, and how to make sure that Stellar is scalable and secure and going to withstand all the tests that it gets offered out there. So it's a really great
mhm.
group of people. It's one of my, if I had to say like the one thing I feel that is I'm most proud of, it's the diversity of thought and leadership in the organization. So it's a ton of fun to work with the folks that we have.
That's cool. And do you feel like having a legal background has given you a unique perspective in working with governments or working in the legal system? Because obviously it's very heavy legal considerations and governmental, like you were mentioning earlier. You guys work quite a bit with other banks in other countries and banks domestically in the U.S. You mentioned the World Bank earlier. I'm curious what's the picture? Like, what is the state of affairs today with the World Bank, their influence
Mm.
over the world, their general disposition? I'm curious
Yeah.
what's
So
if you have any thoughts on that.
in terms of my legal background, I like being a lawyer was one of the most fun things, which sounds crazy to some people, but
Really?
I loved it. And it was fun because like I thought of everything that I did from a trial lawyer standpoint as goals, strategies, and tactics. So what are the client's goals? It could be to
Mm,
win the litigation, it could be to, keep the litigation short, it could be to get a settlement. What are the tactics we're going to use to do that, and how we're going to strategize about to get there? And that learning for me taught me how to approach everything in business. And so I think with respect to policy, with respect to advocacy, and what we do right now with these governments and these banks all over the world, I think it actually helps to have that framework in mind, because every side, no side is wrong.
mm,
It's just that they have a different goal, and you need to figure out what those goals are and bring them together. And so that's what the legal background did. Working with the World Bank and the IMF has just been
mm,
amazing. Working with a lot of NGOs in different parts of the world, because they have such depth of knowledge of the issues that are important to regions. It's really hard to sit in California and to know what someone in Kenya might be experiencing. And it's not fair for us to make those kinds of decisions. But the World Bank has a lot of this information, and they can help to educate us, but also to bring us together so that we can be educated by folks in Kenya, and we can also supply information about how this could help them. So I think that the World Bank has a huge influence on those types of issues, and obviously on funding for local projects in these regions. So I think that
mm.
the use of blockchain, by the way, for the World Bank is something that would dramatically improve their ability to be able to reach the people they want to reach in the regions they're focused on. But in terms of like relationship building and in terms of knowledge, they're awesome, and I love the teams that we work with there. Similarly, with the IMF, they think about the world
Mm.
in a very financially oriented way. And so they have a lot of really good questions as they work with countries about central bank digital currencies. So it's just they're really like NGOs and governmental supported organizations like that are just super awesome for us to be able to partner with.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they certainly have quite the clout, quite the influence in the world. That's for sure. Are there other countries you've seen that are? I hear Estonia quite
Mm-hmm.
frequently, and then sometimes from a legal perspective, the Cayman Islands or what else would be the Caribbean islands. Oftentimes crypto companies will be headquartered in Malta, for instance. I imagine that the scenario there is that there's some I don't know if it's a loophole, but there's an incentive structure that these places have developed to attract uh, companies to headquarter there, and they presumably do that for tax purposes, so they can have some financial incentive. Are there countries that you feel that have structured either the government or some part of society or banking the right way to
Mm-hmm.
attract talent that seems to be working, whether it's people moving there or crypto companies building there, or
That's such
usage
a great
maybe?
question. I think it's really interesting that you highlighted Estonia. Estonia has always been really good at thinking about technology differently and thinking about privacy and being able to build technology to leverage it. So I think that Estonia is just, it's fascinating in terms of, I think, it's on the smaller side, but it's in terms of like
Mm,
the breadth of knowledge that they have there is pretty massive, and their ability to implement it is always pretty fast. The
mm,
Caribbean I find really interesting because like I don't know about how it would be to build a company and to grow a company there, but I think because of the needs that they see in those areas for this notion of financial inclusion, they're actually way more interested at all these the smaller country levels at thinking about CBDCs and the usage of blockchain. And so that might be also why the companies focus on those areas. And there's obviously probably tax benefits. I mean, we saw this in the web too, where companies went to certain countries because there were tax benefits there. What I think that I can't pinpoint a
mm,
specific country that has been really awesomely structured with respect to blockchain. But I'll say that I think that more and more of the smaller countries who have a harder time getting the value transferred, that their constituents have a harder time getting value transferred cross border, are the ones that see this as a huge opportunity. And so I think that those are the ones who are thinking more about how to include blockchain in their financial practice. And then, of course, like you have
mm,
countries like Nigeria, where like they have so much knowledge there and so much innovation that's already happened in Nigeria.
mm.
And then there's fear on the central bank side. And so then the central bank tries to halt a little bit. So they like let it go and then they pull back. And I think that we're getting to a good place with Nigeria too. So I see that there's like lots of countries where they're like, okay, we like it. And then we're like, oh, but wait a minute, these things could happen. And so they get fearful of
Yeah.
it. And so much of that, again, is focusing on use case development and how that transfers value to the
Mm,
constituents. So I think that the world right now is sort of ripe for
mm.
the opportunity of blockchain. And blockchain's already here. And so it's just really good to think about how we can get them to implement it in all these different regions.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly people have been buying it in large part for the appeal of making money or speculating on the price growth. And that's exciting. I mean, that's got to be the first wave of getting people interested in it, which is great. But it does feel that there's a second wave coming and here already, which is the practicality of the innovation in everyday life. There's a company, it was, they were doing Bitcoin mining, for instance. I heard about this recently where they would go out to these rural places in Texas or parts of the country where they would be mining natural gas. And when you mine natural gas, you have to put it inside of a truck and ship it. But
Mm.
in some areas where it's so remote, it's not worth it economically to drive the truck out there and package up the gas. So they just burn the gas. So apparently there is, I've heard this stat, there's more natural gas burned off in the US than Japan uses. And so this company said, "Hey, we'll go and we'll set up Bitcoin mines and remote generators to use the energy from the burned off natural gas and use that to power cryptocurrency miners," which makes so much sense. It's like it's a new kind of it's a new kind of problem. So there's new solutions, which is I find really compelling.
That makes me so
Um,
happy to hear that. I actually didn't know that. But here's the thing is that there's so much focus about when people do invest in crypto because it's the first, maybe their first wave into it, and they don't know about the fundamentals of,
mm,
what blockchain can actually do. It does bring more connection mainstream. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad because sometimes it doesn't actually demonstrate the credibility of what this technology can do. But we can grow past that, right? The thing that I love about what you just said, though, is exactly the way the world should be working. Is that there's all this criticism right now from an environmental standpoint with respect to some of those protocols that are proof of work or proof of stake. We're neither of those, so like we don't have those environmental challenges on Stellar. But I think that the first reaction is always to say it's bad, and so therefore, we should shut them down. And the thing that you just articulated is actually the way we should be thinking about it: is can we make it better, more efficient, easier, cleaner? And can we leverage some of the resources that we have
mhm.
in different geographies to do that? And so it's not saying that the chains themselves are bad. It's saying how can we look at the benefits of the chains and the challenges with them and figure out how to bridge those things. Because I do think that innovation, brings about the good and the bad. And you have to figure out, it's all about, like, I feel like all this conversation is all a balance. Like, it's a balance that you can get to. If you lean too hard on
Yeah.
one, if you lean too hard on the other, you're going to not like the result eventually.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like the phrase competition is for losers. I forget who came up with that. Competition is for losers, where it's like what you said earlier with different goals. I really like the idea of having a goal, strategy, and tactics, but realizing that your goals, this is true, I believe, actually, in politics, that we don't disagree on things. We just are talking past each other on many different things. And there's not people aren't receiving the messages that the other side is saying. And so it's like,
Yep.
everyone's just talking, and there isn't conflicting goals in many cases. And the banking and crypto world's, in a sense, simpler, because you're talking about technology and not human beings. I want to
But
go
it's
back
actually
to
not sometimes, though, because
hmm,
sometimes it's like the humans on the other side of the technology are so beholden
hmm,
to their position that you have the same issue. And one of the things I like to always say is, when you're sitting down to negotiate a deal, you shouldn't just know your position, because if you just know your position, you're going to likely end up so frustrated. If you understand what the other party wants and want to give them what they want and want to get you what you want, you're going to be able to have a true meeting of the minds. And then you'll be able to
oh,
benefit from the agreement. It's the same idea when you think about what technology offers and what the banking infrastructure. What the banks want is to be able to provide these services to the many. The financial system hasn't been built for the many right now. And so actually there's like a nice goal there. It's just the how to achieve the goal that is the challenge, I think, for many. So I
mm,
do feel like there's like, but emotions get raised on both
yeah.
sides, and then people throw out things and don't really think about, like, what is it that we're trying to solve for here, and get to the real root of it, which is, easy to say
Yeah.
in a vacuum, but it actually isn't that hard to do in practice if you stop focusing on the
Yeah.
headlines, because people
Yeah.
focus on headlines.
Yeah. Yeah. It's easy. It's easy to tweet headlines. It's
Hmm.
hard to have long form conversations and understand stuff. But that's why we're here.
Exactly.
um, do you think that one thing I was thinking about when you mentioned Nigeria, because Nigeria is just such an interesting country. They have, I don't know how many people live in Nigeria, 200 million. Oh, there's a lot of people. There's
Hmm.
hundreds of millions of people in Nigeria. And they're, what to say about them? We would, in my crypto company Redeem, we had 80% Niger. We had a lot of Nigerian people, and my understanding after working with them for a while was that there's a lot of really intelligent, smart people that get it. They just understand the challenges of the banking industry. They're unbanked or underbanked, and they immediately understand how Bitcoin is incredibly powerful. And I think Jack, from the CEO of Twitter, went over to Africa because he realized that Africa is, because their banking system is so poor and just poorly established, that they're in a great place with everyone having mobile phones to just leapfrog what our system sort of has. So I almost think there's this challenge that we have, because we have a banking system in place, that we have to mold it and adapt it. Whereas if you started from scratch, like not having telephone towers, for instance, when India rolled out wireless internet and wireless cell phones, it's like, great, we don't need telephone towers. We don't need to lay that infrastructure down. There's kind of an advantage there. And, it's a good thing. I'm not knocking that by any means, but it's a unique challenge that America has to get on board with
Yeah.
crypto that other countries wouldn't have. Um, I was going to ask you something. Oh, what are companies that you've seen or projects that you've seen that you're most excited about, either building on Stellar or maybe
Mm.
specifically not building on Stellar, that you found
Well,
are just pretty interesting?
I love I mean, there are a lot of companies, and I'll talk about a few on Stellar,
Hmm.
but I love the idea of remittance companies and traditional remittance companies, think Western Union or MoneyGram, and
Mm.
what they've built. They've built these agent networks that are all over the world to be able to serve this population that doesn't have access to the financial system. If you think about those companies and what they have to offer if they did get on blockchain, and the services that they could develop through the blockchain, it's pretty remarkable. So those are the kinds of companies that I think we could actually really change the foundations
Yeah.
of finance, and the infrastructure for the unbanked and the underbanked using those. In terms of use cases, like, some of the most exciting to me are the ones that are
Yeah.
bringing these kinds of services to folks that haven't had the opportunity to have it. We have a company building on Stellar called DStock. That company actually has issued tokenized versions of blue chip stock. So think Apple or Tesla. And you could actually buy those
Mm.
tokens anywhere in the world, and they're backed by the assets themselves in a bank account. And so they actually have now been able to get them involved in like purchasing securities from the US. And that's pretty remarkable. So giving folks all over the world access to that.
Mm.
But it's really some of these like simple models that, there's this company called Leaf Global, and they're in Africa, and they're actually in several
Mm.
different regions of Africa, and they're focused on refugees. Refugees oftentimes have to leave a country for 17, 20 years because if it's a government related, and that's why they have to get kicked out of the country until a change of the political party or the government comes into play. And a lot of these people, when they're crossing the borders, they're carrying their cash. Well, Leaf Global offers this wallet, this digital wallet, so they can carry it and have safe refuge across the borders and across lots of borders, so that they don't have to think about that as one more thing they have to get to. And I just love that, because it's a use case that we don't think about here in the
Mm.
United States, but it's one that's directly relevant in a lot of countries and a lot of regions. And so those are the kinds of things that get me excited, is when we're solving problems regionally. We need to think globally, but we need to solve problems regionally. And so that's what blockchain allows to happen, because it's
Mm.
a global network, but it's really relying on the local and regional companies to solve the problems, leveraging blockchain for their constituents. And I love that. So there's just so many opportunities
Mm.
on Stellar for these kinds of companies that are going to make a huge impact in the regions that they're in, and that's exciting for me to see.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. No, I totally agree with you. It does feel like the next wave of the internet in many ways. Um, I want to ask you about Ripple for a second. Are they? To be honest, I don't know a lot of the history other than Jeb was a part of Ripple, and they seem to be doing something similar. I'm curious. Your how would you describe the sort of balance between Stellar and Ripple, and um, how do they sit next to each other and work together?
Yeah, so Jed was a founder of Ripple as well, and then Jed left Ripple and founded Stellar and SDF.
Hmm.
I think the way that I look at it is that we're really focused on asset issuance and payments, because asset issuance in terms of stable coins, whether those be backed by fiat, gold, or some other basket currency, are things that really drive the value, because it keeps it stable. If you use a cryptocurrency to actually do the transfer, so if you relied on maybe the local currency on Stellar, which is an XLM, for example, it could be really volatile and you could lose in Forex.
Hmm.
And so stable coins are really important for cross-border payments. So we're focused cross-border payments and asset issuance. And it really feels like what Ripple, and obviously I don't know the details of what Ripple's plans are, but it feels like they're really focused on the banks and getting banks on board. And that has historically been their
Hmm.
focus. And there's room for both. So like my view on this,
Mm-hmm.
again, is that there doesn't, unlike I think the way that the content side of the web sort of shaped out, where there had to be several, 5 winners that sort of took control of the content side of the web. My goal, and this is, people may say it's a little bit of a fairy tale. I don't think so. I think if you have interoperability amongst all the chains, and you have the ability to leverage the chain for the value that the chain has, then you could, that's the best world for the ultimate consumer and developers. So take USDC, which right now issues
Hmm.
assets on Ethereum, a couple other chains, and also on Stellar, and they have USDC that you can actually swap for all of these different chains. That is interoperability at its core, and drives the opportunity to leverage Ethereum for the DeFi, to leverage Stellar for payments, and the other chains for what value they offer. So I feel like interoperability cross chain allows for constant competition and innovation, which breeds value to the consumers. So that's the way I look at all of these different companies out there doing things in this space.
Yeah, I dig it. I dig it. Although everyone wants to find like the two companies that are battling it out, but yeah, that's probably not the
Yeah, then you
reality of
end
it.
up with what we have on the content side of the web, where you don't have as much innovation
Yeah,
anymore, right? Like that's the whole thing, because the
yeah,
companies that battled it out buy everybody out. So there's a lack of innovation.
yeah, yeah. I really love, I haven't talked to them on the show or even off the show, but I love Brave and just
Mm,
what they're doing with the browser and integrating like crypto payments into browsers and try to
yeah.
displace the
I do
middleman of
too.
the publisher.
I love that. So
Yeah.
Brave was founded by Brendan Ike, who I worked with at Mozilla. He was also a founder of
Oh,
Mozilla.
cool.
So I know
Yeah.
Brendan very well. I love what Brave has been doing. Brave went early in this space in terms of the browser. So they really focused on privacy, focused on security, but they're also really interested in this other part where you can. One of the things Brendan and I always thought that was really important was microtransactions on the web. It's costly to do it any
Mm-hmm.
other way. Blockchain serves that purpose. So I love to see them doing this. They're actually combining the I haven't looked at them in the last few months, but they're combining the notion of the privacy around advertising, and they're leveraging blockchain to actually help to pay those advertisers so that they don't actually have to see ads. The user doesn't have to see ads, but you can tip them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a pretty cool model, and it's one that I love. I think browsers,
Mm-hmm.
they're still going to have a window into the web, going to be that way for a really long time, even though people said it was a dying breed. So I kind of love this innovation in the browser space that's focused there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. I'm talking to you in a Brave browser right now,
There you go.
and I love that they'll pay you. Yeah, they'll pay you to watch ads. There's probably a revenue split share, but
Yeah.
it's such a good example. That was one of the first companies I saw that had a real practical use case for crypto, other than just sending money back and forth between people. It really seemed to make a lot of sense. Last question I have two questions. One, what's the hardest part
Okay.
about your job? What's the thing that you
Hmm.
find most challenging or frustrating or
It's a good
yeah.
question. I think the frustration point for me is that you have to constantly be relying on network effects to be able to grow an ecosystem.
Mm,
And I think it's there's benefits and then there's frustrations because you go 20 steps forward and then sometimes 5 steps back when you grow an ecosystem, because you have players that come in that offer tremendous value and then others come in as a result of that, but then it takes time to be able to get them integrated. So I think it's the value of an open network and this ecosystem that is remarkable, but there are challenges attached to it, which is, you need volume to bring people to a specific player, and yet that you and the player needs volume, but you need to bring people to them, and then they need to add volume, and
hmm.
sometimes it's the chicken and egg thing, right? So that's the most frustrating point. But also, ultimately, if you just take a deep breath and wait, it all comes together, and that's sort of where we are right now in the mode where we're seeing it all come together. That I love
Yeah.
it, but there definitely feels challenges attached to it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. My first startup was a marketplace. We were building a marketplace for home care, so
Mm.
people finding caregivers for seniors in 2013, and it was the exact same thing. Every marketplace has this sort of dynamic, and it is. You're right, though. You really, I find you find the supply side first, and then you wait, and then you tinker, and then there is a critical point where it just kind of clicks and then you're onto the races. So yeah, congrats on all the progress with
Yeah.
everything. What are you into outside of crypto? What are your interests outside of the
Yeah.
Stellar project?
Yeah. So we have five boys, and so we do a lot with them with their sports and also just their lives. I'm a big runner, so I run a lot, and I run every day, and there's that part. But really, I spend a lot of time trying to get them to pay attention to us every now and then, so that we could actually have that back and forth. But they're all at varying ages of whether they want to pay attention, from age 12 to 20. So it just depends. So we get really excited about the things that they're doing, and we spend a lot of time doing those things for them and with them. So at some point, we're going to have
Did
to
you
figure
did
out
you
our
help
own
them
lives.
set up a
Go ahead.
Did you help them set up a crypto wallet?
Oh, it's a great thing. One of our oldest boys is actually very, very into not just the whole like in putting money into crypto, and he's been doing a lot of that on his own, which has actually been really fun to watch. And he's doing it for his brothers too, which is fun to kind of watch. I don't know. Hopefully, it all turns out well. But he's also building things on different networks, which I love to see. So, like, he's looking at the technology part, which is really fun. So enough of a bug has been put into their minds about not just blockchain and crypto, but just the web and the ability to leverage these technologies to do cool things. So it's fun to watch them sort of figure out their own space. So I do love that.
Yeah. That's awesome. That must be a full house. Um, where can people reach you, or if there's anything that you're looking for, whether it's you're hiring engineers or any shout out for, I don't know, banks or engineers or anything, and then
Yeah.
also mention where people can find you on the interwebs.
Yeah, for sure. So stellar.org is where we're going to have our careers page. I would love to have some more engineers out there. I know everyone's hiring for them. Full stack core engineers. We need a lot of folks to be able to participate in the journey that we're on, which is really fun. For me, Denelle Dixon, at Denelle Dixon for Twitter is one of the places from a social standpoint. And also I'm on LinkedIn, but just reach out to us, find information about us. It's really fun to be able to go out there and do this kind of work and to see the change happen real time. So I encourage everyone to participate.
Hmm. Yeah, awesome. And I love the new site. I don't know if it's new, but I love the
It
site. It
is.
looks
So well, it's
really,
a year and a
it's a
half old, but
sexy
it's
design.
it's it's a nice design. Thanks for saying
Oh,
that. They
yeah.
did a great job. Yeah, no, they did a great job. It was
Yeah,
brand, maybe a year ago. Maybe a year ago. Yeah.
that's cool. Well, Denelle, it was really a pleasure to meet you, and I enjoyed our conversation and wish you guys the best. Congrats on all the progress.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Bye.